Superman is one of the most beloved and famous comic book characters of all time and superheroes of all time. He was one of, if not the first of the main superheroes that we all know and love today. Superman has a great, vast array of comic book source material to choose from that can be easily adapted to the big screen and make for a great, epic spectacle. However, with all of that great source material out there in the comic books, Superman, from the very beginning, has always been plagued with production issues, studio mismanagement, from starring in one of the original blockbusters in 1978 to its 1981 sequel, which was shot and re-edited with a different director, to turning Superman into a Richard Pryor vehicle, and then turning him again into an ambitious nuclear disarmament passion project with zero budget, to tragic accidents, to Nicolas Cage all through the 2000s, the 2010s, and into the 2020s. Superman's always had issues with production, all going all the way back to the 1940s with the original live-action Superman. So join me on this journey as I go through Superman's big screen roller coaster ride in the summer of Superman. First, we have to look at the original live-action theatrical Superman that came out in 1948, and sort of the original form of comic book movie adaptations were in the form of serials, which, if you're unaware, serials, they're about 12 to 15 chapter stories. The first chapter is usually 20 to 25 minutes. The rest of them are about 10 to 15 minutes. Each chapter would premiere every week ahead of a feature film at the theater. And later on, the chapters would get edited together and sort of released as a movie for home video. Granted, once they were edited into movies, the serials kind of came out to around 4 hours. So they can sometimes be a chore to get through, but because they're chapters and kind of episodic, it's very easy to just kind of view it in the same vein you would view a TV show. But they were originally theatrically released. And now going back to Superman, from the very get-go, Superman debuted in 1938, and from the very get-go, they wanted to make serials for Superman. And you had Republic Pictures in 1940 shop around the idea of a Superman serial. They wanted Superman to make his debut on the big screen in live action. However, they came to rights disputes because of the Fleischer cartoons being licensed out, and ultimately Republic Pictures had to settle and make a different serial without Superman, which later got repurposed into the mysterious Dr. Satan. After the negotiations fell through with DC, back then known as National Comics, a year later in 1941, negotiations were going a lot smoother as they were getting closer to getting the live-action rights to Superman from National Comics, and they were getting fairly long into the process. However, it fell through due to severe creative differences between National Comics and Republic Pictures. National Comics kind of demanded almost absolute control over the script and just the creative decisions, which Republic Pictures did not like or agree with. And so we ended up not getting a Superman serial in sort of the heyday of the serials. But fast forward 6 more years into 1947, and the live action rights now belonged and were bought by Sam Katzman, and he shopped around the Superman serials idea to a few different studios. That being said, serials were they're still pretty popular at this time, but they were on the decline in popularity. For example, he first went to Universal, but Universal stopped making serials in 1946. He then approached Republic Pictures, who, as I mentioned before, were the original studio trying to make a Superman serial. However, their mind had changed quite a bit, as now they apparently thought a super powerful flying hero would be impossible to adapt. That coming from a studio who tried twice to adapt this same character, and beyond that, a studio that successfully adapted The Adventures of Captain Marvel, which features a super powerful flying hero that not only is super powerful in flying, but he's also a boy that turns into a man at the flash of lightning. And eventually, Katzman came to an agreement with Columbia Pictures. And so now that they have a studio and they have the rights, who's going to play Superman? Katzman found a photo of Kirk Alyn, and he knew that is who he wanted. However, National Comics did not like that casting originally, and so they brought him in for a screen test to just make sure. And during the screen test, Kirk Alyn showed up with a mustache and a goatee. And National Comics stood their ground and did not want him cast, but eventually they caved. Sort of. Because Kirk Alyn was cast as Clark Kent. However, if you pay attention to the credits and the marquee, Superman was not played by Kirk Alyn. Superman was played by himself. So after 8 years of trying to get a live-action Superman onto the big screen, it had finally come to fruition. So how was it? I've seen quite a few of the DC Comics-based serials, most of which are based off of comic book characters that nobody has even heard of today, like Congo Bill and Hop Harrigan. But I've seen most of these, and I'm not familiar with those characters per se in the comics, so I can't comment on those. But, you know, I've seen the Batman ones, I've seen the Vigilante one, I've seen the Captain Marvel one, and that one might be an exception to this. But overall, a lot of these comic book serial adaptations just kind of feel like generic action-adventure serial, but the main character just happens to be named Bruce Wayne and wear a batsuit. But the actual movie and story, it's not Batman. It's just a character named Batman. However, with the Superman 1948, it feels like a genuine comic book adaptation and a genuine Superman adaptation. And because of that, I genuinely appreciate it. And this is probably my favorite serial that I have ever seen. It's still a serial. It's still got a lot of things with it. It's an outdated storytelling method. They didn't have nearly the effects that they have today. And so it's kind of a product of its time, but it's a very, very charming and innocent product of its time. And one of the best examples of why I genuinely like this and why it feels like a true Superman adaptation, unlike the Batman ones, which don't feel like a Batman adaptation, this one starts right off like any other Superman origin movie. Right there on Krypton, you have Jor-El in front of the Kryptonian Council trying to convince them of Krypton's doomed fate. And you get to see him load baby Kal-El into a spaceship, and you see it fly off. And the special effects in this movie, they're not even really trying. Like, you look it up, they never really tried to make it look super realistic, which is something I'll get into a little bit later when I talk about another topic regarding this movie. But because of that, when Krypton explodes and you see the spaceship, it kind of looks like a little Marvin the Martian cartoon to me. Just that's what it reminded me of. A lot of the special effects in this movie are very much like a Space Jam, Looney Tunes back in action feel to it, even though that's obviously not the intended thing. But it is one of the things that gives it a charm for me. And then it transitions into his time at Smallville, being raised by Martha and Eben Kent, not Jonathan. Because back in the 1940s, they were a little loose with what Superman's parents' real names were. There's even a version where it was Sarah instead of Martha. So probably one of my favorite parts of the entire serial is in this first chapter when they're in Smallville after he saves his father from a tornado. And you get Eben Kent giving a little speech to Clark that's very Uncle Ben-like, but before Uncle Ben's responsibility speech was even a thing.
You have a great responsibility.
And so he's talking about how he has these powers, and because of that he has responsibilities, and he needs to honor truth, tolerance, and justice, which sounds a little odd. It took me by surprise initially that it wasn't Truth, Justice, and the American Way that he said. However, Truth, Justice, and the American Way, while it did appear in the previous 1942 radio series, it wasn't solidified as an actual Superman motto or catchphrase until the 1950s during the Red Scare. And so this is just a nice time capsule that you won't see very much, where you get truth, tolerance, and justice instead of truth, justice, and the American way. It's just a fun little thing that took me off guard, but I really liked what they did with the scene. It's a little cheesy and aged not the best, I guess, but it's a very heartfelt moment that I genuinely loved. And you get a moment where Martha gives Clark, apparently she was able to knit together bulletproof clothing, which I guess doesn't make sense, but it's a sweet moment nonetheless. So eventually you get to Metropolis with Lois and Jimmy after sort of that chapter 1, which is more of the origin. And so you get to Metropolis, and on the way there, Superman has to stop a train. Sort of that first example of Superman stopping a train, which he does in almost all of his adaptations, a very similar trope. And the villain of the movie is Spider Lady. Now, Spider Lady isn't necessarily a big comic book character for Superman, obviously. This isn't like someone from his huge rogues gallery. But also a lot of his modern rogues gallery might not have existed yet. But here you get Spider Lady, and I thought Spider Lady was pretty good. But her whole main plan is to steal this device, this reducer ray, which essentially you like type in the longitude and latitude, and then this connects to, I believe, like a satellite or something that shoots down rays at that location and that longitude and latitude, and essentially just blows it up and destroys whatever's in that location. And like I briefly mentioned, Kryptonite makes its live-action debut as well, and you get Spider Lady going and getting her goons to steal Kryptonite for her so she can stop Superman from stopping her evil plan. And you just get a lot of charming, just old-school superhero versus supervillain type of stuff in this. But eventually, Superman defeats Spider Lady because she gets trapped in her own electrified web. And in terms of the cast, you have Pierre Watkin playing Perry White. You have Tommy Bond playing Jimmy Olsen. You have Carol Forman playing the titular Spider Lady. Nelson Lee playing Jor-El, which I thought he did a great job at playing Jor-El. And then you have, honestly, one of the very underrated and underappreciated Lois Lanes, that being Noel Neill. This was her first time playing Lois Lane, but she would later also go on to play Lois Lane in Season 2 through Season 6 of The Adventures of Superman, right alongside George Reeves in the 1950s. So she played Lois Lane for 2 different Supermen for good reason. She nailed it out of the park. She is an amazing aspect to this movie and probably the brightest spot of this movie. And in terms of Kirk Alyn, I thought he was the perfect Superman for this movie, for this serial, because he brings the charm and he brings sort of that old school, classic, Midwestern Boy Scout feel to both Clark Kent and Superman, but he also is good at making Clark Kent feel a little more clumsy than Superman. It's not the best portrayal we have ever seen. It's not, and it's far from the worst portrayal, and I think it works extremely well within the confines of this serial. Lastly, I need to mention the flying sequences and most of the visual effects, which are probably the most controversial and divisive aspect of this serial. So originally, the plan was to have Kirk Alyn kind of behind a green screen laying down on a device, like wire-like device, to show him flying through the air. However, they did screen tests of that, and both the directors and the producers did not like the final product of those screen tests. And so they decided to go the route of essentially having these almost Fleischer-esque cartoons over the live action shots. So sort of the reverse of a green screen. I can't speak for people that were alive during the time that wanted to see Superman in live action fly, but looking back on it, I just have to look at it on my own terms. And in my own terms, I found it very charming. It gives this a charming feel that you don't get from Christopher Reeves. Like, you get charming feels from Christopher Reeves, but in a different way. And I just thought the Fleischer-esque cartoon style of visual effects give this its own little feel. However, there were a lot of people in the time frame in 1948 that kind of wanted to see a live-action Superman and were kind of bummed about the fact that it was a cartoon whenever he flies.
I have talked to people who to this day remember being disappointed that they didn't really see Superman fly and that it was a cartoon.
So overall, 1948 Superman is a charming, harmless, and accurate for its time adaptation of one of the world's most famous superheroes. Because of its age and the outdated method of the storytelling technique being in serials, it won't be for everybody, but if you're a hardcore Superman fan, I encourage you to give it a chance. And this is a rare serial where I genuinely enjoyed it from start to finish, from chapter 1 to chapter 15. Most serials, I enjoy the first couple chapters and the last couple chapters, but that middle section, I kind of lose interest. This was not the case. This is my favorite serial that I have seen, and it does get a thumbs up from this guy because of its charm. And if you are interested in checking it out, Superman from 1948 is available to purchase on Apple TV and Amazon. So thank you for watching this video on the original live-action theatrical Superman from 1948 starring Kirk Alyn as Superman. And if you want to join me on this roller coaster journey through Superman's theatrical run, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell as well, and hit the thumbs up, and leave your comments on Superman 1948 in the comments section down below. And always stay super.